Evolution.org, episode 616 is coming your way. Today we have a interview with Mark Williams. This is going to be a BPC 157 and TB500 Recovery and Bodybuilding interview. And Mark Williams, I'm going to bring in Mark right away, and he can explain some of his background so we can get to know. How you doing, Mark? Tell us a little bit about yourself. So go ahead, Mark. Yeah, tell us about yourself.
Hi, I'm coming up to 61 years old now. I've been lifting over 40 years. I started off powerlifting, ended up as Welsh powerlifting champion for the under 100 kilos. That was way back in 1998.
That's 220 pounds for our American friends.
I've also done over a dozen bodybuilding competitions, tested and non-tested. And I've got to say, I have thoroughly enjoyed myself.
Sorry, but just let me interrupt for a second here, Steve. One of his competitions was privy to. He was in the hospital the day before with his Crohn's and a lot of blood, etc., etc. And then literally, I think it was 7 hours in hospital on the Saturday and competing in stage in condition on the Sunday. So Mark is of my local buddies with the ongoing medical issue and, of course, the same strains, aches, etc., that us older lifters tend to have. Got with the Crohn's as well, quite a hardcore motherfucker to say the least. And even now, we've looked at Mark's numbers as a powerlifter, and he would probably have Welsh Federation best deadlift for your age. Actually, I think we looked at all the age groups in one federation and all the body weights in one federation, and you probably still have the record. And he does this stuff on a regular basis. But I think for the listeners' purposes, Mark is a great example, not just of the older lifters, but of any lifter with injuries, aches, pains, the simple stuff of pushing our bodies in the gym, and a great deal of experience as well. So that helps. But even some of the stuff, listeners, that we're talking about today will apply to you younger listeners and some of you that have got 5 or 10 years. I think it's quite common, Steve. Me and Mark talked about this in the pre-show. It's almost a joke, a meme to say that when you are serious about your stuff, you've probably got some sort of ache and pain. And specifically today's topic, TB500 and 157, the use of what we call healing peptides, both injectably and orally, is becoming incredibly popular. And as Steve and I talked about in the pre-show, pretty much almost 100% of the examples I've seen where people have used these, and even our own personal experience, we've seen really, really good results from sensible use, 4 to 8 week cycles, sometimes a little bit longer, and they're becoming SARMs generally here in the UK, but specifically these two healing peptides are becoming very, very useful, very, very helpful. So today's show specifically, we're going to talk about that. Sorry, Mark, just to bring you back in, talk about how difficult it can be in the combination of Crohn's and, of course, ongoing injuries and strains that lots of older lifters will have anyway.
Start off telling us what Crohn's is, because a lot of listeners don't even know what it is.
Yeah. Well, Crohn's is a gastrointestinal disease. It also destroys your immune system. Back in 1987, I had most of my intestine removed because it had rotted. And what they tend to do is connect the fresh intestine up to the bowel, and you go again. End game, you probably are going to end up with a bag at some point because you'll run out of intestine and still have the Crohn's. It is the most random illness known.
It's very, very difficult to treat.
We can be sitting here like this, and I'm perfectly well and healthy today, and Steve may very well get a phone call in 3 or 4 hours' time. They've taken Mark in, he's flared up. It is that random. There is no warning.
Weeks when you're uncomfortable, weeks when you can barely digest food.
There are times where I live literally on ice cream because it's all my body is willing to accept.
Essentially, Steve, as I understand it, and Mark and I have had this conversation, and again, it's for the benefit of the listeners, the body is, for some perverse reason, in both Crohn's and colitis, it's essentially ulceration of the lower intestine, and the body is, for some perverse reason, only attacking or treating as a foreign body that part of the healthy gut, which would normally be healthy. And it makes it very, very difficult at times to digest food, absorb food. Sometimes you have to have an incredible amount of calories just to get in absorbable amount of calories. So as a bodybuilder or weightlifter, it's very, very hard. Ironically, and this is another reason why Mark and I talk about this, for those of you that struggle to eat, some of the things that people with Crohn's and colitis have to do actually benefit you because of the nutrient density food they eat, only eating certain particular foods. Sometimes Mark can have foods that he can eat for weeks, and then the next few weeks he can't eat it at all because it flares up again, and the body's sort of decided he doesn't like it anymore. So we've talked about starch with regards to potatoes. We talked about ice cream. Normally this would be fat motherfucker territory, but it's literally just getting you to absorb sufficient nutrients to get through the day. When you are ill, and this is just again for the benefit of the listeners, Mark obviously knows this firsthand, you feel very sorry for yourself. You are literally laying on the sofa. You are not sociable. You haven't got the energy to be nice. It's literally, how many doctors have you spoken to after the last 20 years? It seems that you've probably gone through people's careers where they come sometimes, and this is not just for you, this is for anybody with your medical symptoms, your medical issue, where a new consultant, a new expert will come, and they almost go back to the beginning. And one of the issues that Mark and I have discussed at great length is one of the best drugs is growth hormone. Definitely. Because it repairs the gut, it's repairing your intestines. But for whatever reason, bearing in mind the sheer cost for you just as a patient anyway, the NHS seems loath to prescribe sufficient levels of healing growth hormone due to the cost. And yet, ironically, for example, in say if a consultant, you're talking about a six-figure salary, you probably spent multiples of hours with these six-figure salary people, and they've tried multiple different forms of medication, and of course the operations that Mark's already discussed, and all of that is a cost. I would actually argue, and again, this is again for the benefit of our listeners, when we talk about our approved sources, Steve, we know that as on a cost basis, growth hormone is probably as cheap as it's ever been, because you and I have talked about this on other shows, Steve. And ironically, it's almost funny, I'm laughing, it would probably be cheaper to have the NHS source products from one of our approved sources, because the NHS is probably still paying £500 a month for a month's supply, whereas you and I know that we can source $120, $160 online. It's crazy.
I was going to say a big reason for that is in America, what happened was they started giving pain pills. Doctors started prescribing pain pills, and it got so bad that crime started skyrocketing in some parts of the country. Yeah. Because doctors were being so loose when it comes to prescribing that. But I mean, obviously, crime is going to go up from using growth hormone. But what we have seen in America is with TRT clinics, they're basically going crazy prescribing TRT to 25-year-olds and giving growth. So I think that's why the NHS is saying, you know what, wait, let's pump the brakes on this, because people are taking advantage who don't even really need TRT or growth hormone, but the doctors.
Something else, Steve. Something else. There are, of course, I mean, our listeners that listen to these shows on a regular basis, not just these when we talk to our guests like we are with Mark today, but what we've also seen is there are obvious side effects to using high dose, and it wouldn't be a high dose; it would be a sensible dose of growth hormone. But here's the thing: when you've got Mark's medical condition, or any listeners out there with aches and pains and whatever else, you can mitigate or manage the side effects. And there are, for example, in some users, high usage is water retention or insulin sensitivity. I think Mark would be happy to have a little bit with water retention, or happy to have to sort of deal with insulin sensitivity if it meant, and to put it crudely, and this applies to both Crohn's and colitis, we talked about Imran Malik.
Yes.
Imran Malik has colitis, you've got Crohn's. And it can mean, and I'll put this crudely, that you are shitting 20, 30, and I've seen examples online of people 40 times a day.
Yeah.
You are literally, all the body weight and the muscle that you've added is falling away. You can barely eat. You're having thousands of calories just to try and get your energy levels up, and you are literally having to go for a shit as many as 40 times a day. 20 is normal.
Yes.
15 to 20 is normal. 30 is kind of uncomfortable. How Imran was working in the shop when he was having to go for a shit 20 times during the shift, 8-hour shift. It's just crazy.
You cannot hold down a full-time job.
No, you can't.
No one's ever going to get their pound of flesh. I can turn up to a job and be the hardest worker for 3 weeks in a row. And then for the next 6 weeks, you may have an hour one day, an hour the next day. I may be off for the next 2 weeks. And then I'm back to... Nobody can employ you unless you're going to be self-employed, sat in front of a computer at home, able to do that. You cannot physically go out in the workplace and make yourself somebody else's burden.
Let me ask you, Mark. This is again for the benefit of listeners to Steve, who doesn't know you. Give us some of your numbers that you've done in powerlifting. So I know, for example, you're good for, and I'll translate this into pounds, 260, 270 kilo deadlift. For the benefit of the listeners, 250 kilos is 550 pounds. So 270 is around the 600 pound mark. Yeah.
My target at the start of this year, when I turned 60, was 600 pounds. I lift, as they call, organic. No belt, no straps, no suit, completely raw. 270 is where I left off at in January. I missed it by 2.5 kilos. I'm back to pulling 265, 267.5 again now, and that's at a body weight of 205 pounds.
What about you competing as a bodybuilder? What's your best body weight, and how many bodybuilding competitions on stage have you done?
I have done at least 15 competitions.
Wow.
I've never finished out of the top 3, including the one I did when I got off my hospital bed on the Saturday morning to drive across country to compete. I probably stand on stage at about pounds 185.
Ripped this, by the way.
Yes, probably 4 to 6% body fat.
I think you've got abs pretty much year round.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what?
Sorry.
I was going to ask you if we can backtrack a little bit. What got you into powerlifting and bodybuilding and weight training in general originally? Is this something that you came across as a teenager, or is it something later on in life you got into? And what made you get into it so deep?
Funnily enough, it's down to the Crohn's disease. I was sent home from hospital with no diet, no nutritional information. And of course, back in the 80s, there was no internet. It was a case of going to the library, grabbing books and finding out what people who were getting bigger and putting weight on did.
Yes.
And the thought was, well, if I've got to eat like them, let's go and do what they do. And the bug bit, and I've never looked back.
Let me interrupt again here, Steve. Something that's actually, I think Mark and I have touched on this in conversation. And again, this is a benefit of the listeners listening to this podcast. There's a certain degree of irony at sometimes how the media portrays us when it comes to training, when it comes to steroids. But ironically, the media has, and specifically other sports have, learned from the bodybuilding diets, the bodybuilding lifestyles, the importance of nutrition. Athletes years and years ago, and Stevesmi and I talk about this all the time. We talk about American football, ice hockey, baseball in the States as being the 3 big games. And something that used to happen with soccer in this country, and soccer even in America, would be that they would play the game, they would practice field goals, they would practice plays, but nutrition was secondary. And then over time, bodybuilders being very, and I'll put it this way, anal about the way we are with proteins, anal the way we are with macronutrients, how we specifically use foods almost as a tool for what we do. And specifically in this example with your medical condition, we actually gave something to those sports. You have nutritionists working with film stars. You have nutritionists employed by American football teams, employed by ice hockey teams, because they realize that the recovery of their players, who they're paying tens of millions of dollars to in some examples per year, never mind basketball or whatever, the really big contracts, golfers will have a nutritionist, because if you're injured, can we use nutrition to help you recover? As in this example, and this is the reason why Mark and I have had these conversations in person, in the gym, etc. The idea that your microbiome, your stomach, gut flora, etc., can be reset is one theory. The idea that if he has to ingest what we would almost call dirty calories, Steve, as many calories as possible, because he knows he's not going to absorb and use all of those calories, is useful for the guys that struggle with appetite. He knows, for example, and I've talked about this on shows, guys sometimes worry about losing a few pounds of muscle, losing their gains, etc. And Mark will have times, because of his medical condition, where he's the week before hit a PB on the deadlift, pushed his body weight back up to, say, for example, 15 stone or whatever else. Yeah. And then within 10 days of being impacted by the medical condition, impacted by Crohn's, he's dropped 10 pounds. He feels like a washed out dish rag. He can't physically, he doesn't even have the energy to walk to the gym and work out. So I want to move this on slightly now. Right. So in recent years, and again, I say this as an older athlete myself, and just with conversations with people like Mark, Phil Thompson at the gym, etc., and even just online, again, for the benefit of the listeners. So TB500 and BPC157 have probably for the last, and you even talked about Paul Scarborough,
like 10 years or more ago.
Yes, more than 10 years ago, starting to talk about these two peptides and the specific benefits. So I started to pay attention, I would say it was probably more than 10 years ago, Mark.
Yes.
Seeing stuff on Muscle Talk, where an athlete's got a niggling shoulder injury or similar condition to yourself, and either using growth hormone, which was kind of expensive then, but it's cheaper now, or using BPC and TB to cycle for 6, 7, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, whatever level cycle they decided to do. And as I said earlier in the show, nearly every single time, and probably every single time really, it's just that they weren't coming back to give you feedback. All of those that gave feedback were saying, I've had great results. Phil Thompson, with the oral product that we're going to talk about briefly, as well as injectable, within 4 days, his shoulder started to feel better.
4 days seems to be the regular feedback of, we are seeing a vast improvement while taking BPC 157.
You wasn't getting what we were hoping for. We actually talked about this in the pre-show. We said that BPC comes from, ironically, was isolated from the gastric juices. So with your gut issue, we was hoping that orally ingesting BPC would actually improve the gut lining, improve the way that your stuff. That hasn't happened as much as we'd like.
Not as much as I would have liked,
but you have had improvement in your other
systemically, definitely.
Inflammation and so on.
Tell us about the dosing that you started with.
Yeah, so he's using an oral product. So and I just said this in the pre-show to Steve, and I'll bring Mark in for the actual dosing. The oral product is slightly less bioavailable, so utilized by the system versus the injectable. We are seeing more oral products, including approved sources, available, and even the combined product with both BPC and TB500 in the same product. So talk about the oral version that you're using and how they're dosing your oral version.
The BPC 157 I'm using at the moment is 500 micrograms twice a day. Now, compared to the injectable, which is probably a top end of 400 micrograms, that's a massive difference. But what I am finding is systemically, it's making a huge difference. Going back to the Crohn's disease, unfortunately, it's linked to so many other things. I am riddled with osteo and rheumatoid arthritis, not as an older athlete, but from the ages of 8 to 9 years old. I've had my left knee completely replaced from shin to hip 11 years ago. I move differently when I'm on BPC 157. I'm a better oiled machine, for want of a way of putting it. And my confidence when lifting weights while on this is far, far better.
Yeah, I mean, an obvious thing here, which Steve would understand as someone who's been lifting for a while, and of course has done a 400-pound bench press himself. Wow, you have a really good idea. I hesitate to use the words as advanced lifters because of our demographic, but the reality of the situation is the heavier you lift, the harder you train, the more recovery is important, and the risk of injuries, the risk of aches and pains is higher. That's just a fact of life. You don't get to be the best athlete in the world and not risk injury running really fast, or play 20 years as an American footballer and not have some sort of shoulder or knee injury from being impacted by the other players when you're playing. That's just a reality in that. But it also means you become more aware and you try to become better educated in regards to what's worked for you, what's benefited your recovery. And again, this is part of the reason why we got you on the show today. So we bring you on and we say, look, we've looked at the injectable version and the oral version, and both have their places. The oral version tends to be dosed higher just so that there's more available to the system when it's digested and absorbed into the body. That makes sense. And then at the same time, because you and I are arguably elite in some of the things that we do, we are trying to eke out an oomph degree from our training, our mental mindset, etc. You more than I am trying to get as much as you can out of nutrition. I'm not a bodybuilder, so I don't need to be that focused, but I still have to have half an eye on what I'm doing nutritionally. We benefit from, as per this podcast, passing information backwards and forwards, and just sometimes you and I bouncing ideas off of each other. Yeah. Have you tried this? I've seen this. What's the latest thing on this? And I actually done this with Steve in another show where we talked about growth hormone. Again, we talked about the AIDS and HIV victims, as you remember, Steve, and how they were being given these things. And then the bodybuilders got sometimes a spare product from these AIDS victims, from the HIV victims. And that's how we was able to buy and try and realize that growth hormone was really, really good and benefited bodybuilders and weightlifters and strength athletes. So this backwards and forwards passing of information, things, for example, and you've actually had this happen to you as a patient, because you train, because you are looking at the nutrition, you've actually had some really good conversations with the top medical professionals locally that are trying to help people like yourself, and they're just giving them the prescription medication, etc., prescribing. But you've actually said, I've been trying this nutritionally, I've been trying this training-wise, and giving that information back into the system to benefit other people, like we're doing with this show.
The physicians that will ask me about how I'm coping with my disease, rather than tell me about how I'm supposed to be feeling, are far more helpful than anybody else. As soon as they say to me, tell me about your disease, I know I'm on a winner. They will sit there and listen to what I have to say.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I've had Crohn's disease for 40 years.
Sorry, Mark, you're not, I mean, this will apply to some patients. You'll have patients that won't eat properly anymore, or they don't look after their health. And this could apply to other medical conditions as well. So the simple fact that you train, you're trying to stay in shape, you're trying to stay a certain level of muscularity, you have done because you competed, you're trying to maintain a certain level of strength, and you're therefore more aware in that particular regards. So you are looking after yourself, even if we push the envelope sometimes.
Yeah.
And equally, you are constantly looking at nutrition, hence the conversation you and I had about starch, and so on and so forth. And this benefits you if it works. If it works for you, you then pass on information to other people with similar conditions, other athletes that might struggle with appetite and digestion or so without your medical condition, and then the listeners themselves. So, for example, Steve, if we found some miracle way to recover from training when we had an injury that shortened people's training after a recovery, let's say that you've had a shoulder injury, you've torn your rotator cuff. We had one on the forum this morning, and he said, he even mentioned TB and BPC, ironically. He said, what other advice can you do? And I said straight away, do every single minute of the rehab you're supposed to do. Is there any nutrition that I could be doing, changes to my nutrition that could speed up my recovery? Is there any therapy that you guys have used that could speed up my recovery? And this backwards and forwards exchange of information, even just on the forum, never mind in this show that we're doing now, it's incredibly beneficial. The simple fact that, ironically, you're actually sometimes giving this information to the benefit of others through the consultants, through the doctors that you're talking to, is of benefit to other users. And again, the simple experience for the benefit of our listeners, again, Steve, of someone who's not only got the usual aches and pains from lifting stupid weights and training for multiple years, which is perfectly normal for some of us old strong bastards, but also for the younger listeners who might play other sports. Steve has done this as well, where you're training in the gym and then you go and play a little bit of touch football at the weekend, or, a little one-on-one on the basketball court or whatever else. And you get to a certain level, you've always got an achy knee, you've always got an achy elbow or whatever. And the idea that the information that we put out in the show today that might benefit people in a particular way. Let me change the subject a little bit. And I think Steve and I did a show on this recently, Steve. So you and I talked about gut health. I'll let Steve start to begin with on this one, Steve, because we've talked about fasting, and of course you have to sometimes. Yeah. So talk a little bit about fasting, Steve, as a way of healing as well, with regards to your own experience, and I'll bring Mark in for that part as well.
Well, there's a couple different things with fasting. You mentioned earlier growth hormone has been shown to help with people with Crohn's. Of course, not overdosing, but when you fast, the more you fast over the course of 5 days, your growth hormone skyrockets well beyond where you would be able to take exogenously. So it's basically free growth hormone. So when you sleep at night, your growth hormone goes up because you're not eating. Your body's in a rested state. So fasting will boost growth hormone. Fasting will also create autophagy, which will eliminate old sick cells in the body and create new ones. So that's a great way to rebuild your gut health. So I have a backstory as well with inflammatory gut issues because I grew up with IBS, but at the time it was never diagnosed because like Mark's problem in the 80s, I had problems too in the 90s because in the 90s they didn't really understand the nutritional stuff that they know today. They didn't understand things like the FODMAP diet, low FODMAP, which is avoiding certain inflammatory things like gluten, dairy, garlic, onions, these condiments, like a lot of these sauces, things even like pepper, and certain spices. Now, I'm not talking about black pepper necessarily, but I'm talking about the fruit pepper. Some fruits, fermented foods will inflame the gut as well. And a lot of people, they they don't understand these things, so they'll continue to eat these foods and they continue to put themselves back. So fasting is a great way combined with a proper diet to really get your gut health under control. Now, as an adult, I've been able to do all these things and I've been able to control my IBS very, very well. There'll be occasions where I'll eat something that has something that I shouldn't eat, and boom, my IBS will flare up, but it's very, very rare. But as a kid, it was like I was having to constantly, like you, Mark, I was constantly having to go to doctors and ERs and emergency rooms, and they could not figure out what the hell was wrong with me because of that. So we're very lucky today to know, hey, fasting helps. Fasting, and it's one of those things where if you have IBS, Crohn's, or any of these inflammatory gut issues, it may never be cured, but it can be controlled, and that's the good thing. That's why fasting is a big help. And obviously, the more food you throw out your body more often, the more work your gut has to do. So if you're eating 8 meals a day every 2 hours, your gut never gets a break. But if you're eating in a time restricted window, boom, now your gut has time to process that food and has to do. So tell us.
One more thing, Steve, specific to food again, and again for the benefit of our listeners. One of the things that Steve and I have talked about multiple times, and you've probably had to be very selective with the way you've eaten at times. What works today doesn't work tomorrow, so on and so forth. We talk about regularly on the shows the issues of processed foods and the effect on the gut versus healthy foods or specific foods. So talk a little bit about the way that the processed food versus the organic, clean, locally sourced, and in Mark's case, specific foods that you can eat that are beneficial to you. Yeah, go on.
Well, I'll talk about it a little bit, and I'll let Mark follow up on all this. But here in America, we have a big problem, a much bigger problem than you guys have in Europe. Because if you guys come to America, you'll notice this. You go out to restaurants or you go grab a burger or something. Our foods are toxic because companies, they have, we have so many restaurants and so many fast food joints. The margins are tight. They make such a small margin on the food they sell because food is so cheap in America. So the quality suffers. So refined oils are killing us. All the additives that they put in their food and all that stuff not only clogs up your arteries, but it also irritates your gut in the process. So you've got to prep your own food. So those of you listening to this you're like, oh, I want to use BPC, I want to use TB500 for these inflammatory problems I have, whether it be your gut, whether it be injuries, whatever. Well, if you continue to eat these inflammatory foods, you're just going to make it that much harder. You might as well not even waste your time with TB500 and BPC because you're asking it to do too much. So clean up your diet and that will drop the inflammation in your body, and it will allow the TB500 and BPC to do a better job for you and get you where you need to go. So Mark, follow up on all the stuff that I've just talked about. Go ahead. Floor is yours.
On the side of the fasting, I fell into fasting as a lucky mistake, really. I found that eating early in the day before I trained, my stomach did not like it. So I ended up eating later and later and later. And for the last 12, maybe 15 years, I don't eat before 3 o'clock in the afternoon any day of the week. Doesn't matter whether I'm training or not. And my body much prefers it that way. It doesn't want, as you said, 6 or 8 meals a day. If I can keep my meals down to 2 or 3 and get nutrition in that way, my body is far happier.
A lot of athletes are following that. Like we've talked about it on the podcast. We're one of the few podcasts that talks about it. I know you guys don't know who this is, but Derrick Henry, he's one of the top running backs in the NFL. You can look up some of his videos, and this guy like runs all over the field, running people over. Like nobody even wants to tackle this guy. But his first meal of the day is like 4 p.m. And he's huge and muscular and strong as fuck. But people think, oh my God, you got to eat 10 meals a day. And you don't. He's living proof of that. But there's so many athletes like that. Tom Brady, Rob Gronkowski, I can go down the list. We see people who are MMA fighters who are following time-restricted eating and fasting protocols to give their body an advantage. Who's that bodybuilder mobster who eats the once a day, the OMAD diet that we talked about before? I can't remember the name right now. You know what I'm talking
about? I can't remember him either, but
he's big on it.
We've seen bodybuilders from 10 meals, as Steve says, down to 1 meal, and people are obsessed with the idea of having multiple meals or snacks or whatever else. And look, you and I talked about this from the biological, historical point of view, when we said, listen, human beings haven't always been able to eat every day. Never mind sit down at certain times. Never mind have high protein meals. They've had the biologically the ability to digest pounds of meat if they've not had food for days, and literally fallen asleep to let the food digest, and then the next day had no food whatsoever. It literally was hunting and scavenging. So I want to talk a little bit, Steve, or shall I bring Mark and yourself back in? And I think from your perspective, Mark, and again, this might be beneficial to the listeners, which foods you find when you've had gut issues you've been able to eat all the time, and experiments that you've done with certain foods which have worked briefly and then not worked?
What I tend to find is I don't deal well with high fiber foods, which goes completely against what people will tell you for gut issues. Oh, the fiber work, I can't do it. I don't do it. I don't eat fruit and I don't eat veg, not because I don't like them, simply because I cannot cope with them at all. The last time I got rushed in with a severe flare, I'd had 2 mashed bananas, because my logic was they give babies mashed bananas. And no, my body won't do fiber. I can't have it.
What about, just as an example, I mean, this is from the bodybuilders that are listening to this show, younger or older. We can sometimes, as bodybuilders, and specifically, obviously, or more generally speaking, as athletes, become a little bit obsessive on occasion. And ironically, I don't have great tons. There's the odd occasion where I'll eat a big steak and I'll probably get 300 grams. But for the most part, and I run a log before Christmas for the benefit of the forums, and I was barely hitting 200 grams of protein a day. And yet I think my highest body weight, and I've talked about this on other shows, at that particular point was 336 pounds and was hitting PBs, as you've seen me doing the gym, Mark. So while we understand the importance of protein as part of recovery, just for your own purposes, again, when you've been struggling with your gut issues, with Crohn's, what would typically be, you think, your protein intake, and what protein sources have you best managed on when you've had the issue?
I manage better on dairy products after
which again,
a flare,
we normally say,
which isn't something they recommend. But I found that this particular disease is so individual. A quick aside to this is one of my sons has it, and his Crohn's presents totally different to mine. He can eat all the foods I can't. I eat all the foods he can't. You would think with the same DNA and genetic structure, there would be some semblance, but there's not. Totally different.
Are you by like your background, like ethnic background? Because I've looked into this as well. Because I have my girlfriend has Crohn's, and when I met her, she had a big problem where she literally would have to know where the emergency room was and which hospital she had to go to at all times. It was that bad. But I've worked with her, and now she has it completely under control because I've changed her diet. But I'm wondering because in her family everybody seems to have it. So I'm wondering, do you think it's tied to certain ethnicities, or is it something where is there like a genetic, based on your research, is like a genetic, something genetic that's in there that certain people are more prone to it?
I think it's more genetic than ethnicity. I'm the first person that I know in my family with it, and my son, he's 22. He's had it since he was 11 years old, and his is right where was mine was in the small bowel. His is from his throat right the way through his intestinal tract. So I think it's
Okay.
more a DNA genetic
Yeah.
problem than
Yeah, I
anything
think it
else.
is because I've noticed people from like the Middle East, Mediterranean, North Africa, maybe even Southern Europe tend to have these inflammatory diseases. And I think it has a lot to do with the way they evolve with their diets versus what they're eating today, or what they a lot of them, well, it's weird, a lot of them immigrate to America, and this has to do with any disease. A lot of them immigrate to America and end up with certain diseases, then they move back to their old country and the diseases go away. So that's something that's really
Yeah.
interesting that we've seen the past 50 or 75 years, and that can go with cancer or heart disease or any of these diseases. So I think that's always fascinating to see as well. What's your thought
Yeah,
on that?
we're obviously, I mean, Mark, as well as the way that you just talked about there, Steve, you're obviously, that's the way that our brains work, listeners. We're constantly looking to see if there's a connection between our lifestyle habits. Listen, when guys come onto the forum, when members come onto the forum, whether they've got a gut issue, whether they have a training injury, whether they are struggling to put on body weight, there are sometimes things that are mentioned and sometimes things that are not mentioned. So, for example, Steve and I talked about the water in America and to a lesser degree the United Kingdom here in Europe is not as clean as it used to be. We talked about the lowering of testosterone levels generation by generation and the reasons why. We talked about earlier in this show, and again, this is all part of the learning and the thought process. Are there connections? We talked about earlier in the show the food quality in America and again to a lesser degree UK and Europe. As Steve said, that the rules and regulations here are better, but they're still not perfect. So, for example, processed foods, pollution. Here in the valleys of Wales, men on average were dying younger because the last generation had worked down the coal mines and in the steel mills, in the ironworks, and essentially had breathed in so much crap into their lungs, Steve, that on average we died 5 years quicker or earlier than the rest of the United Kingdom. So we had medical surveys and tests done for all the 50-plus-year-olds, including myself. When in Mark's case, you say, right, is it genetic, as you've just argued? Is it food? Is it inherent in our lifestyle? Are we, for example, training so fucking hard that we are, and Steve's used this analogy, constantly inflamed? And if we're constantly inflamed, are we suppressing our immune system? So again, this is again for the benefit of the listener. We have these conversations amongst ourselves in private, online, and via this podcast, and we say, right, if we realize there's a connection, if we understand there's a connection, if we realize that something we're doing is actually harmful to our bodies, we can mitigate that. We can do less of it, or we can completely remove it. If a certain food is causing a problem, but I won't eat that food no more. If a certain medication, one of the issues, for example, Steve, and this, I don't think this applies to Mark, but it might apply to some other listeners. And I said, listen, the average American adult is, according to various statistics, on 5 different prescribed medications. The problem with being on 5 medications is that sometimes they interact in a bad way. You're being treated for, let's say, for example, an inflamed knee, and I give you an anti-inflammatory, but because your knee's so bad, I give you a prescribed anti-inflammatory, far stronger than the stuff you could get over the counter. That becomes, in and of itself, anti-inflammatories will irritate the stomach. Now you're a bodybuilder and you're training. So you're trying not to irritate your knee. You're using vast amounts of protein, which in and of itself, arguably, you're irritating the stomach because it never gets a break, like Steve said. You might be not eating enough leafy vegetables or consuming enough vitamins and minerals. You might not have, as you touched upon earlier on, enough fiber in your diet. And yet you're eating 4,500 calories a day and pounding the fuck out of yourself in the gym. So even if the listener doesn't have a medical issue, the reason why people like us that do these shows, Mark as a guest, etc., think this way is because A, we're trying to fix ourselves. That's number one. Number two is ultimately, as I said, these kind of conversations, lateral thinking, crossing information backwards and forwards, bringing in different users, bringing in different experts. Steve's interviewed multiple experts, pros, etc., doctors and so on various shows over the years. We've had guests on when I've done the shows with Steve. And I would argue, Steve, that every time we've had a guest on, we've learned something new, or we've made them think something new in a different particular way. We go away and rethink a subject, and that's how we've all benefited. So it's not just Mark's a great powerlifter, Mark's a very, very good powerlifter, he's got this particular medical. We end up having this back and forth conversation, think about outside the box, think about perhaps why, for example, Steve, I would want to know why someone could have a medical issue living in America because of the lifestyle, because of the food, because of the prescription medication, whatever else, go back to Europe and not have it. Literally, why would being in that country or in that situation
just jump in there?
Yeah, of course you can.
Steve, my wife is South African. She's Botswanan. And both her and her sister found the same thing when they came to the UK. They gained weight uncontrollably. Yet, when they went back to Botswana, within a week, 2-3 weeks, a month, the weight started to come off them again. And they're eating the same types of foods.
Yep.
But they both found that while in the UK, they could not control their weight gain.
Yep. And if they came to America, they gained 20 pounds. You know, it's the same thing with me when I travel to other countries. I tell people this all the time. I'll go and I'll have 3 meals a day, 3 big meals, staying at an all-inclusive resort. I'll have cheesecake every meal. I'll have, sweets. And I'll come back and I'll weigh myself and I'm down 6 pounds. And I'm like, what the hell just happened? If I ate that way in America, I gained 20 pounds. It's crazy. But that's...
If I stay at my mum's, I lose 4 pounds in a weekend. And this is, I mean, remind me, I think your background is Middle Eastern, genetically speaking, isn't it, Steve?
Yeah, North African and Mediterranean region.
Dylan Gamelli, that we've had on shows and is a very good friend of ours through these programs, is Italian American. You're probably just about as Welsh as it's possible to be, whereas I'm a London fella. And it's kind of weird, certain situations. So you think, is it a cultural thing? Is it literally going back to a warm country that's warmer? Is there way more walking involved and so on and so forth? And again, it's silly stuff. I mean, just as a tangent, where we talk about people driving to the gym to do cardio when you might as well walk to the gym.
Yeah.
Instead of don't have to use the treadmill.
You know how I feel about that.
And then it's silly little things like Steve and I have had multiple conversations on these shows about the necessity or otherwise of breakfast. I think people imagine, again, talking to me, because I'm that much bigger and heavier than Mark, that I eat more food. Mark probably eats more food than I do, out of necessity. Yeah. And yet, so there's a sort of how my metabolism works, and even I can't eat certain particular foods. I think Steve and I have talked about, again, in these shows, just as I digress again, the difference between different races and their ability to digest dairy products.
Yeah.
And even things as well. So let's go back a little bit now and talk about TB.
Yeah. So I want to hear, more. Go ahead, Mark. Yeah.
Can I put a caveat on the BPC TB500?
Yes. Get into it. Yes.
The BPC157 is found in the gastric juices. This is why I feel, as an overall product, it is definitely going to work. That's what its job is. Whereas the TB500 is more site-specific, and I'm not as confident that works as an oral, or at all, maybe. Definitely not as well as it would as an injectable. But that's just my take on that. Yeah. Because I feel that TB500 is definitely site-specific, whereas BPC157, as it's found in the gut, it will.
So I just want to
Yes.
clarify, when you say site specific, can you clarify what you mean by that?
No,
You're talking about a specific injury, or are you talking about?
No, you and I know, Steve, that the difference in the injectable forms for BPC and TB is that one can be jabbed, arguably, or injected anywhere in the body, and it will heal an injury.
TB, with injectable TB, you can just pin in your stomach and it goes all over. BPC, you want to get close to the injury as possible. What's ironic, though, is that some people say they'll go to anti-aging clinics, and the anti-aging clinics will tell them the opposite. So it seems to be what Mark is saying. Like, Mark, are you hypothesizing that when you're taking in an oral form, that it works a different way than injectable? Why do you think that is?
Will it work? That's the argument.
I'm not convinced TB500 is going to work as an oral. Or as effectively. I feel you need to be pinning that at the injury site.
Whereas the
BPC157, as it already culminates in the gastric juices, is more of a overall systemic effect.
Yeah, taking it orally, having it digested by the very juices.
All right, fair enough. Yeah, I think at the end of the day, people need to try it out and see how it works with them. But tell us some of the other benefits. It's helped your gut. I noticed when I took TB500, because I do a lot of like boot camp training as well. I do a lot of hot yoga. It's very, very intense when it comes to cardio. I've noticed it helped me with that in terms of endurance. Is that something you've noticed as well when you're going high reps and heavy on that last rep? You're able to push out another rep?
Definitely. I find with the BPC157, most of my training are singles. It's how It's all I train. I hit 80% of my max on every movement.
Steve, let me jump in here. I think, and I'll let you tell us the numbers. He's done a thing, Steve, where, and again for the listeners, you might want to try this. Was it 40 singles? One every 90 seconds for an hour or something ridiculous. And these are all 90 or 95% of his one rep max. Again, so you're looking at 200 plus kilograms, 440 pounds. More than that, in fact. Again and again and again. When the timer on the phone, every 40 seconds, one of these repetitions with a weight that most of us, especially the younger listeners, will be happy to pull once. And Mark's done this 40, 50 times in a row for every 40 seconds for the best part of an hour, or whatever specific period of time that you're talking about. And again, look, the stress on your body in that example, or in Steve's hot yoga or whatever else, it's brutal. It's unbelievable. You're going very, very close to what would be most people's one rep max for one. And you are doing 95% of your own one rep max, so the best ever lift. And you're doing it
60 times.
Yeah, 60 times, 40 times, 50 times, 60 times. So the idea that if he can do that with his medical condition, and he can continue to do that using TB and BPC, is something to be looked at. Just for recovery, never mind injuries and whatever else. I'll touch upon this as well. So the other example, and I mentioned him earlier in the show, is Phil Thompson. Phil is 60.
In his 70s, no, Phil's in his 70s.
Yeah. So it's got to be 70, 71 now.
Yeah.
Just recently, I believe. And as someone that's probably been training 20 plus years in his example, Phil's not a competitor. He's probably closer to our average listener, Steve. He goes to the gym to keep in shape, to look in good nick, as we say here in the UK, for someone of his age. I don't think he's ever been is interested. I know he's interested in rugby, but I don't believe he's ever played outside of school or whatever else. No. So he's a normal Joe that's worked in the mines back in the day with the white finger issue. And he, like Mark and myself and other older athletes that train at Powerhouse, all pretty much using TRT.
Yes.
Has done for a while. It's kept him kind of young looking and enabled him to train. But for whatever reason, over time, just sheer wear and tear. No, he doesn't do any silly weights, but just sheer wear and tear, was struggling, as some of our listeners will, as they listen to this show, with aching shoulder joints, issues with the rotator cuff, from pressing, from a little bit of benching. He's not a powerlifter by any stretch of the imagination. And again, as we said earlier in the show, just to add to this again, so I'd had a conversation with you, back and forth, few conversations. You'd gone out and bought the oral products, and you'd mentioned it to Phil. Phil come and spoke to me. So I said, this is what I know. I mentioned, obviously, the fact that you and I had a conversation. Steve and I have done shows when we talked about healing peptides. I've seen what I'd seen online, did a little bit of look with regards to the bioavailability, taking an oral product. As you and I spoke about the effect of ingesting it versus injection. And again, Phil came back, and I'll touch on SARMs as well as peptides. We've seen a growth of SARM use in the UK in steroid users to the point where they are raving about certain of the SARMs.
Incredible.
And an uptake, I would believe, I could say this confidently, an uptake in older athletes, 60 plus in this example, injured athletes, even when we have the knowledge and experience that you and I have going back decades of the peptides, and specifically these two, the TB500 and the BPC157. And again, he literally said, Steve, and again, to the benefit of the listeners, I've been using the doubled up to BPC and the TB product together as an oral product, one pill, slightly higher dose, as we said earlier on, because of the lack of bioavailability for digestion. And within 4 days, the feedback was, I can feel my shoulder getting better. My shoulders feel freer than they have done in years. I'm able to push that little bit more weight. He's never been a big, strong guy. That's not how he trains. But when you probably had something that's been annoying you, pain-wise, Steve, for 10 years or something, certainly a very long period of time, and you found something relatively cheap, certainly if we do through the sponsors and approved sources, and especially via the sales, etc. I mean, just as an example, Steve talks about this, and I'll bring Steve in for this, when we talk about something like this and the benefits of using something like this, and I think you say, Steve, you use the analogy, you pay more to have your car cleaned. Yeah. You pay more to have your car detailed. And the idea that you can be pain-free or healthier or push harder in the gym or lift heavier weights. Yes. And especially not just for the injured athlete, but for the older athlete. Talk about that a little bit, Steve, as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, people spend more on their pets. They give their pets the best food.
Right, yeah.
They don't want their pet to have health problems, but they don't take care of their own health. So I want to give, we don't have much time left, but I want to give Mark as much time the last, end of the show. Tell us more, Mark, some more tips and tricks for people out there who are looking to powerlift, who are looking to use TB500 or BPC, some of the things that you've learned through your vast experiences. We want to hear more from you.
I would say powerlifting wise, stick to heavy basics, which obviously everybody knows about but don't do, and stop repping. Nobody's asking you to rep in a powerlifting contest. Find your max and work on percentages around that consistently.
Yes.
Otherwise, you're trying to do too many things and you can't. No good saying, yes, I can.
And it's just harder to recover again.
But with the BPC157, my recovery is incredible. I'm even more confident going to the gym now, workout on workout, than I've ever been. And I mean, I'm used to deadlifting 85 to 90% of my max, 7 days a week, no days off. Yeah. Steve will back me on that.
Christ, yeah.
Month in, month out.
Yeah.
I wanted to know on that. Is this something that you plan on using, like kind of like an HRT protocol, or is it something that you're loading for a couple months and then you're going to kind of take less and less of?
No, I from the research I've done and from what I can glean from the information that's out there, I don't see any reason to come off these peptides.
Yes.
They're already,
they pre-exist in
the body. I mean,
they're not suppressing.
I see no sense in stopping using something that you feel is working when it's not raising your blood pressure, affecting your kidney, affecting your liver. It's pre-existing in the body.
But in terms of dosing, are you loading it like the first couple months and then you're going to use less and less of it? Or is it something you're just going to keep the same dose?
I front-loaded the BPC in the first 10 days.
Yes.
And I found that was helpful. I move so much better when I'm taking it. My lifts are cleaner. And I'm more confident.
Something else, Steve, and I'm going to ask Mark this again for the benefit of the listeners. We see people come on to the forums with various injuries, typically, again, a rotator cuff and a knee and the elbow. And it's almost a joke, Steve, where if you go to the doctor with this particular pain, it hurts when I do this, doctor, we'll stop doing it. So one of the issues that a lot of lifters and bodybuilders will have is that we train because we like to train. And unfortunately, sometimes the things that we do hurt us. So give the listeners a bit of advice on the benefits of time off, the benefits of recovery and rehab, and of course, again, the benefits of using peptides, painkillers, natural anti-inflammatories and so on. In other words, the importance of recovery and not completely pounding away at an injury like a maniac, as we have been guilty of.
It's not even that. If a movement hurts, substitute it. Stop doing it. You're doing it more.
Change the angles.
Yeah, doing it more is not going to make it better. I mean, you don't have to squat to get strong legs. You don't have to bench to get a big chest. If these things hurt, don't do them. If you feel you're coming into the gym and you're already under the weather, turn around, get in the car.
Sorry, Mark, you're a rare example of someone, and I think to a lesser degree myself, we're probably outliers in that we're able to do certain things at a certain level, even on our easy days, even on our light days. Whereas the reality is that a person who's not been training for 40 years, not been training perhaps arguably to some of the levels that you and I have been to, and even for myself, Mark and I won't go balls out all year round. We will our foot's always on the gas, but it's not always down to the floor. We're not trying to red line. We're not trying to max every single session for weeks and months at the time. So yeah, give our listeners a few more tips and tricks before we finish off. Just stuff and training and whatever.
Steve mentioned earlier about my 1 rep every 40 seconds. Now, I'm a big believer in quantifying results. I will lift a deadlift 1 every minute for 40 minutes. I will take a day off. I will come in, I will lift 1 every 40 seconds for 40 minutes. I'll have my day off. I will then come in and lift the same weight twice a minute for 40 minutes.
One more thing, Mark, and you and I have had this conversation. We've talked about, Steve, some of the authors and people that you've looked at with regards to different kind of ideas of training that stimulated you in training. So talk about 1 or 2 of those just before we finish the show.
But going back to my last comment, that would mean I've lifted twice as much in 3 workouts. How many people can look at a logbook and say, hang on,
in 3 workouts?
In 3 workouts, I have just doubled my volume. And that's just lifting singles.
And that came from one of the authors that we're talking about.
Nick Nilsson, the mad scientist of muscle, has some fantastic articles on getting stronger, on specialization on body parts.
You've directed me to a couple of articles that I've looked at as well with regards to some of the stuff that's out there.
He's another outlier, but his techniques
and his thought process
are very individual and very, very interesting. He keeps everything fresh. I won't say makes a game of it, but it makes it enjoyable to come to the gym instead of just picking that weight up and down all the time.
Makes you want to go to the this is a benefit to listeners. Makes you want to go to the gym, gives you a new challenge, enables you to come at something that you've been hitting perhaps with one angle at a different angle. Sometimes throws out the typical knowledge that we would normally recommend. And again, Mark and I might be outliers in that particular way that, for example, I use a much lower volume than most bodybuilders, and yet I'm the size that I am. Typically, for example, again, in my example, Mark literally deadlifting three times a week at 90 or 95% of 1 rep max. And normally that would be probably the worst thing you could do, especially for someone who's new to the sport. But for you to stimulate strength and growth at this point in your career,
it's consistency.
And requires. And literally, as he said just now, listeners, he can show Monday, Wednesday, Friday that he's doubled the volume in a week, when for most people that might be 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks.
Some may never see it.
Yeah, exactly. And looking at some of the quote unquote mad scientist type articles and whatever else, the idea that you can stimulate something new when you and I shouldn't be producing greater results. Mark, just again for the benefit of listeners, with his medical issue, even with the experimentation, should not, arguably, if you and I didn't know who Mark was, Steve, he should not be producing the numbers and the results and the benefits that he's getting at this stage. He shouldn't be improving at 61. He shouldn't be able to double a volume in a week at 61. He shouldn't be able to do those things with Crohn's at 61. It makes no sense. And yet at the same time, as per the conversation, and again for the benefit of the listeners, we're able to have this back and forth. We're able to look at what's going on. We're looking at the mad scientists for exercise stuff, looking at the bioavailability of orals versus injectables, looking at dosing protocols and so on. Just as an example, and I'll finish on this as well, Mark, and you and I have had this conversation already. Someone's got an injury. They're using BPC and TB500. How long would you normally, if it was just recovering from an injury, how long would you recommend they run that? 8 weeks, 12 weeks?
A minimum of 8 weeks. 12 weeks is probably the sweet spot, but I would say you've got to just really get that benefit. I would say a minimum of 8 weeks. You will see results the first week. There's no, that's the feedback.
Right, listeners, come onto the forums, listen to these shows, check out the articles that we've got on peptides and specifically these healing peptides. Throw us some questions if we haven't thought of anything. Let us know your thoughts on the subject. Any thoughts before we finish, Steve?
No, I mean, Mark, any final words?
Did you enjoy it today? I enjoyed coming on the show.
I just had to say thank you for having me on the show. I have thoroughly enjoyed myself. I hope I've been of some use and somebody will learn something from what we've been discussing. And I hope you all stay healthy and good lifting.
No problem. Thank you very much for coming on, Mark. Please note, we are not doctors and the opinions are ours. It is our view based on our experience and views on the topic. Our podcasts are for informational purposes and entertainment only. The freedom of speech and the First Amendment applies.